I want to start by welcoming everyone to our Science Activities Committee lecture by Elena Danielson. I'm Suzanne Roth, a member of the committee. And the procedure is that Elena will speak for 45 minutes approximately, and then we will have your question put into the chat room. And Elena is going to be introduced by another of our friends, Sally Herrick, who was at Hoover with Elena, and Sally was the director of major gifts. And Sally then served on the board of overseers. And thank you, Sally, and thank you, Elena.
Well, good. Thank you, Suzanne and Nancy and everyone. Glad to be here. Hello. Before I begin introducing Elena, I would like to acknowledge with sadness the recent passing of George Shultz at the age of 100. And he was truly a great American statesman, a true patriot. He was our colleague at Hoover for the past 30 years, and Elena and I, along with many, many others, admired and respect and loved him. So we'll miss him. So today I am delighted to be here to introduce my colleague and valued friend, Elena Danielson. And it was 24 years ago that I first met Elena. I had just begun my career in the development office at the Hoover Institution. And for those of you who are not familiar, Hoover has sort of two parts. There's the public policy side with fellows and researchers. And then there's the archives and library side located in the Hoover Tower. And at that time, I had very little information on Hoover archives. I sort of had the notion that archives was a place where papers were put and were never seen again. and by the time I met Elena, she was already a highly credentialed and an experienced archivist. And she, having received her undergraduate degree from UC Berkeley, and then going on to Stanford for her master's and PhD in German studies, and then back to Berkeley for her master's in library science. And then finally beginning her 27-year career at Hoover, becoming director of the Hoover Library and Archives in 2001. So the photo behind me was taken after Mr. Hoover began collecting what he called fugitive literature. And in 1914, at the beginning of World War I, the Hoovers were living in London, and they were both profoundly moved by the plight of civilians trapped between Germany and the British blockade. So on his own initiative, Herbert Hoover undertook organizing a massive relief program, which oversaw food distribution to 9 million desperate people in Belgium and France. And it was from this experience that Mr. Hoover came to believe that by collecting and preserving the fugitive materials of war and conflict, future generations would come to understand more about the causes of conflict and the paths to peace. So this photograph shows one of the first shipments of documents to the newly established Hoover War Library on the Stanford campus. And Herbert Hoover was sort of way ahead of his time in collecting and preserving archival materials. He believed that the records of history could give some insight for future generations. And today, with more than 6,000 archival collections and 50 to 60 million items, the Hoover Archives are one of the world's largest repositories of documents, films, photographs, posters, and ephemera. These collections tell the story of war, revolution, and peace across the globe. And to just give you a few examples of what is in the archives, for example, scholars from around the world visit Hoover every year to access the records of the Soviet KGB. Or they come to look at the original diaries of Chiang Kai-shek, or the records of the Nuremberg Nazi war criminal trials, or the records of the Polish Solidarity movement. And more recently, a large collection from Iraq of Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist Party. So as an archivist, it is Elena's responsibility to collect, organize, and to make accessible these unique materials, and especially to protect and to preserve them as an accurate record of history for future generations. But Elena's greatest gift to me and to many others is her ability to bring to life a glimpse of the past and to make us feel that connections with history those connections with history and with the present time. And during my years at Hoover, I was fortunate to travel with Elena on various trips to Poland to restore the nation's government records that were removed to Hoover for safekeeping in 1939, and to Warsaw, where we were welcomed as heroes. The Polish people to this day remember and honor Herbert Hoover for his humanitarian efforts after World War I. And to Germany, where we visited the Stasi archives of the secret police, where documents that had been shredded as the Berlin Wall fell had been meticulously pieced together by archivists to provide an accurate record of what happened under communist regimes. And to Prague, where we visited the recording headquarters of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, instrumental in keeping freedom alive in Eastern Europe during the Cold War. And all of these broadcast tapes are now in the Hoover archives. And to the Netherlands to visit the restoration of the carillon bells from Hoover Tower, which had been given to Herbert Hoover in 1939 in gratitude for his food relief efforts in Belgium. And today, Elena will be focusing on one very small part of the Hoover record, but one that is important, and that is on the life of Lou Henry Hoover, who was an extraordinary woman in her own right. But before I let Elena begin, let me tell you a few of her unofficial attributes, my personal observations. She never met a document she did not love. She never throws away anything. Every document has value. Every item is more than just a piece of paper. There's a story behind it. She has beautiful handwriting. She takes organized notes with a traditional ink pen, never any scratch outs. She keeps exquisite notebooks and albums. She has a prodigious memory. She has a remarkable recollection of every place she's been and people she has met. And she has an amazing knowledge of what actually is in the archives. I often wonder if somehow she has read all 50 million items. And most of all, she brings history alive to all of us who know her. And so today, Elena is speaking on Lou Henry Hoover and the history of technology.
Sally, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Sally took me to the best places to give donor talks, to the Ritz in San Francisco and the Palace. We just had some great floating down the Danube on one of those Viking cruises and everything. No, we had a fabulous time. So thank you for the wonderful introduction, Sally. I'm awash in nostalgia. And lunches and dinners with George Shultz. Can I talk about Shevardnadze? He came to lunch with his wife Nanuli, who didn't understand English, and she slept through all of the speeches in English. And she was born in Georgia and was an expert on Georgian poetry, the Republic of Georgia, Tbilisi. And so George Shultz had a guitar player come out, and he started singing Georgia on My Mind. And the newly Shevardnadze woke up from a deep sleep and just smiled broadly. And Shultz had saved the occasion. So he was an extraordinary man.
Absolutely.
It is sad, but he's left some wonderful, wonderful memories. I'm going to talk about one special person who I got to know in the archives. I never met her in person. This is the wife of Herbert Hoover. And I do have some slides. Let me see if I can get the screen share up. Give me one moment here. It says host disabled participant screen sharing. So maybe we need to.
Go ahead, it's ready.
It should be enabled now. Okay, and let me go to share. All right. So we're going to start from the beginning here. And this is Lou Henry Hoover's oil-painted portrait. This hangs in Hoover Tower today. I used to walk past this every day. So I've walked past it thousands of times. And there's a duplicate oil painting exactly like this in the White House. So this is the official portrait of Mrs. Hoover as she's remembered as First Lady. But First Lady is a career she never aspired to. She really didn't want her husband to run for president. As it turns out, she was probably right. And she had a goal growing up in life. She wanted to be a scientist. She wanted to be a professional geologist. And she understood geology not in the narrow sense of a few little minerals or something. To her, geology was a history of the whole earth. And she was specifically interested in mining, which again to us sounds like a very specialized field, but to her, mining was something bigger. It was the engine of technology, and she devoted her life to the history of technology, and she left one outstanding masterpiece. When I listen to a lecture, I usually come away and remember one thing. I want you to remember two things, okay? I want you to remember that Lou Henry Hoover was more than First Lady. She was a professional scientist. And I want you to remember that she published an incredible masterpiece back in 1912. And this masterpiece, it's called De Re Metallica. It's not a household word, but I want you to remember she published a masterpiece that is still influencing the way historians think about the history of technology and the history of civilization. And she ended the introduction to her book saying, "Science is the base upon which is reared the civilization of today." And her book is determined to prove that point. And she didn't take credit for this masterpiece. Her husband's name comes first, and her name comes second out of protocol of the era. She was always very deferential to him and very supportive of his career. And yet she had this great contribution that over 100 years later, and I'll try to prove this point, over 100 years later, her book still has influence. She went to Stanford University, and that's how I knew about her, and that's how she met her husband, in 1894 to 1898. She was born in 1874, died in 1944, and in her lifetime, for a woman to have a career in science was impossible, especially a woman who had a family life. And she wanted both a family life and a professional career. And when she graduated from Stanford, she wrote a letter to her best friend, and she lamented that she wished her AB degree stood for a boy, because she couldn't get a job in her field. She tried and tried, and her mentor tried. Here she is, two photos of her at Stanford. On the left, she's collecting botanical samples. So she understood geology as the history of the whole world, more like the way we understand ecology. So her whole life, she collected botanical samples. And here she looks a little bit like some of the friends I had at Berkeley in the 60s, you know, the flower, but she was high-spirited and creative. On the other side, you see her with her mineral samples in her chemistry classes. So at Stanford, she took chemistry, trigonometry, took all the hardest courses. And yet she had trouble finding a job. What was she going to do? How did she succeed? There's a big story here, and I think it's worth looking into. So where did she come from? She came from a family in Iowa, a place called Waterloo. I had never been there until 2 years ago. There's not much there. There is a statue of her there. She came from a very closely knit family that pulled up roots and traveled every couple of years. She had a very close relationship with her mother and father and sister, and the four of them lived in rented homes all over, in Kansas, in Iowa, in Texas. They were moving all the time. But she claimed it was a very happy childhood, and it encouraged her to be very independent. And she wrote an essay in 1890 when she was 15 about the importance of being an independent girl and going your own route. And this took a little work because she was not confrontational. As a woman, she encountered lots of obstacles, but instead of confronting them directly, she went around them. So how did this work out? Well, let's go 2 years forward to when she's 17. Her dad, who's always trying out a job, he's a banker in Texas, And then he works as a teller in a bank in Los Angeles, and they're moving all the time. And then he buys a stake in a gold mine. He's trying to make money. So he wants to dig it out of the ground. So he takes the family of 4 and a tent in the summer of 1891. And the family goes to a place called Acton, where there are lots of mine shafts and things. During the gold rush, there were mines that were producing. He bought shares in a mine that didn't. And it didn't matter because they had a fabulous time. Lou said that the summer she spent living in a tent with her mother, sister, and father was the happiest time of a very happy childhood. Now, I'm not sure her mother agreed with this because the tent wasn't waterproof and it did rain, but Lou was thrilled. And one thing her father encouraged her to do was to go down into the mine shaft underground. So I've participated in one of your programs, which was all about outer space. So this is more about inner space. She loved going down into the mine shaft, checking the ore samples, trying to get a sense if there really was more gold down there or if it was all played out. He had her using, here she is, a 17-year-old teenage girl. Instead of sitting in the parlor like most Victorian era girls, she was down underground. And it turns out that all over the world, in China, in Africa, in Europe, in the United States, in Cornwall, miners do not want women going into the mine shaft. There's a universal taboo against this. And it turns out mining is a very superstitious industry. It still is, but was even more so then. But she decides mining is what she's interested in. She actually was very talented.
Oops.
Oh, frozen.
Okay, no. Oh, Elena.
Mathematics. She did well with her father. He would hire her as a school teacher from UCLA and San Jose State, then called the normal schools because that was for teachers. But she entered Stanford to become a geologist. She had tried working in a bank and wanted to be paid $250 a month like one of the men, and they said no. And then she worked as a school teacher and they gave her a substitute job for the 3rd grade and she wanted something more challenging. So she went to Stanford and she majored in geology. Her mentor was a man named John Casper Branner, who was very influential. Here you see her at a picnic. Stanford in the 1890s didn't have a whole lot going on. So the students would go off on picnics and they'd go hiking in the Sierras. And it was a very outdoorsy life. And she was quite athletic. So she loved hiking, fishing. She was also a very good shot. I don't know if you noticed, but in the previous slide, let me just go back up here. She's holding a rifle. She was a good shot. She used to hunt rabbits. And I actually think that was putting dinner on the table because they were genteel middle class, but strapped for cash. So here she is at Stanford. And if you'll notice, she's holding a pick. This is the symbol of the geologist profession. This was the profession she identified with, and she was very serious about it. The other girls on this picnic are holding apples. Well, she has one too. And for some, I'm sure there's some symbolism going on here. I'm not quite sure what it is, but the important thing is she really identifies with the professional geologist profession. And here you can see the pick as the symbol of miners. It shows up in Walt Disney cartoons of Snow White and stuff. Miners always hold this pick, that's their symbol. The guys who go down underground, and here they have long beards and funny hats. But the geologist pick was a very important symbol for her. And her mentor was a man named John Casper Branner, who went on to be president of Stanford. He was a very charismatic geologist. He understood geology, like I said, more as the history of the earth, including botany and zoology and all of that. He was also a bibliophile. He was very interested in the history of mining, and he had some ancient mining books. And one of those ancient books was called De Re Metallica, the history of metals. It was published in 1556, and he had a copy, and he hired Lou, who was short of cash, to help out in his library. I'm a librarian, so this was the dream job, right? And Herbert Hoover also helped out in the library, and they got to handle the rare books that he had collected. He brought, when Stanford was opened in 1891, Branner bought a whole train car full of geology books, many of them ancient and rare, and brought them to Stanford, which didn't have a very good library, but the geology library was one of the best in the world. Looking a little grumpy here, but he had a really cordial, warm relationship with both Herbert Hoover, who was one of his prize students, and Lou Henry Hoover, and he really was like a father to them. And it's often said that Lou was the only or first or, you know, whatever, geology major in the world or in America or in the United States. Well, geology was a man's world. Women were not welcome. They weren't hired by the US Geological Survey. How would you make a career if you're not going to get a job? Women weren't allowed in the mines, but there was a lot of interest. And when I looked at the geological club in the quad, which is for you know, the Stanford students, it's their, you know, when they graduate, everyone bought the students in the geological club, there were 5 women. So it was something women wanted to study, but there were incredible obstacles. And Lou actually overcame them, but by going around the obstacles, she was a strategic thinker. She didn't try to barge through unwelcome, but she managed, but in a circuitous way. And the price she paid for that is nobody knows that she was a scientist. But I don't know that that mattered to her, whether people knew or not, but she was far more successful than she realized. When she died in 1944, she had no idea that her masterpiece would continue to influence historians of science and technology to this day. So here, she has this dilemma. She has a degree in geology. Her mentor, John Casper Branner, adores her. He's looking high and low. I looked at the correspondence. I looked at the letters she wrote to him there in the Stanford Special Collections, a wonderful place to work. And she's begging him to find her a professional job. She can get a job as a school teacher. She's highly qualified. She knows languages. She knows Latin. She knows German. She knows math. She can teach. She could get a job in a bank. She's good at accounting. She's good at, you know, numbers. She's good with the public. She's very popular, but she wants a professional position and she can't get it. And we have his letters to her in her papers in West Branch, Iowa, in the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library. And I even went to Iowa to read them. There was a trip to Iowa, believe me. So it was a very frustrating moment after she graduated, month after month after month. He's trying to find her a job. He thinks he's got one, she doesn't. And suddenly she writes him a letter in February of 1899 saying, "Dear Professor Branner, you can stop looking for a job for me. I've decided to marry Herbert Hoover and we're going to China." And she actually went as his wife and unofficial business partner. Branner was totally shocked. He had no idea they were engaged. Her parents had no idea she was engaged. She was an ostensibly very open, friendly, gregarious, you know, bouncy person. You'll see this if I get the video to play at the end. But she kept her own counsel, and I don't know that anybody knew what she was exactly thinking at a given moment. But she surprised everyone. Her mother wrote a letter after finding out at the beginning of February. They married February 10th. The beginning of February, Herbert Hoover comes from Australia. He's made his first fortune. He'll make a second one in China. He brings her a diamond engagement ring. And Lou Henry Hoover's mother, who never groomed her for the marriage market, but wanted her to be a professional like she wanted. Lou Henry Hoover's mother wrote a letter to the family announcing the wedding saying, well, we really, really wanted to hate Herbert Hoover for taking her away from us, but he stayed with us a few days and we fell in love with him too. And so they gave their blessing, and this is Lou here. And you can see she's leaning on her father's knee. She was very close to her father, like she was to Branner, her mentor, and with her husband. And here she is in her traveling outfit. They got married in traveling clothes so they could leave for China the same day. And in China, she studies mining, the mining practices in China, and this is 1899 to 1901. The mining practices are very medieval. The ore is brought up in baskets and carried on the backs of mules. There is no industrialization in China in 1900. And Lou starts studying the whole situation. And Bert, her husband, is very interested, not just in modernizing the mines, but both of them take a strong interest in the history of mining. You know, how did these people learn to dig these tunnels? And how did they reinforce the tunnels? And what kind of civil engineering went into this? And how did they know where the ore was? And so they took an enormous interest in Chinese history. And Lou, being very good with languages, learned quite a bit of the Chinese language. So she had access to people, could talk to them. And so she went down in mine shafts in China in 1900. And the Chinese were very superstitious. They didn't want women in the mines any more than the Cornish miners in California. They didn't want women in mines either. And she just went down in there and explored and studied how everything was done. And it wasn't that different from some of the things she had seen in Acton with her father, with the winches and the way the mines were developed. And then something happened. The Chinese, of course, and that's certainly understandable, resented all the foreigners mining their coal and gold and taking their treasures. So the Empress of China encouraged a rebellion against the foreign businessmen. That included Lou's husband. And there was something called the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. And it was more than boxing. There was artillery. The Boxers were actually heavily armed. Quite a few people got killed. She was in the middle of an insurrection in a siege that went on for months before the foreign armies came and rescued them. And here she is, you know, she's 24 years old. She's on the barricades. She's helping people who are wounded in the confrontation. And she writes a letter to her best friend, the same one she wrote to about how she wished AB degree stood for a boy. She said, "Oh, Evelyn, you missed one of the best opportunities of your life by not coming to China when I asked you. It was the most interesting bombardment of the age." So it didn't matter how dangerous the situation was for her as long as it was interesting. And she wrote and published a defense of the Empress of China, saying the Empress was justified in questioning the exploitation of China. She studied something in London. They had to leave China. The center of the mining industry was in London. So Herbert Hoover and Lou Henry rented houses in London. And she started taking advantage of the libraries at the British Museum and started studying everything she could find about geology, minerals. And in China, she got interested in the clay used in fine porcelain. And she collected blue and white porcelain. And the Chinese had kept the formula for porcelain secret for hundreds of years until it was finally recreated in German by German chemists. So she studied in the British Museum about 1901 to 1906 the properties of porcelain and also had quite a fine collection herself of blue and white porcelain pots. So she published, let me go back here. She published a 100-page bibliography on historical ceramics with her mentor, John Casper Branner. But guess whose name was listed as the author? You know, it was the guy, right? And then she helped edit her husband's lectures on mining, the principles of mining. And guess whose name is listed as the author? Her husband. And her husband was Herbert Hoover was a brilliant manager. He could go down in a mine shaft, decide it was worth investing in, bring in modern equipment and make a fortune. He had already done that twice. He was asked to tell people how it was done. He knew how it was done, but his English was lacking. He never graduated from high school. He got into Stanford on a wing and a prayer. He would have flunked out of Stanford, except he had help from, I think, Lou and a professor to pass his English requirement. He lived to be 90. He never learned how to spell properly. So this book would never, it was brilliant, but she was the one who was the writer. So this book would never have happened without her. And the mining community was a very small, tight-knit one, and they knew it. And the Principles of Mining got very, very good reviews. And the Mining and Metallurgical Society issued a statement saying Mrs. Hoover has been an important collaborator on Principles of Mining, and she worked on it when he was called away. So in 1909, he started working in Russia. He was going to the Ural Mountains every year. So he really didn't even have much time for the writing, and she did it. At the end of Principles of Mining, there was a wonderful paragraph called The Engineering Profession. I recommend it for you. You can find it online. And it says, and we know Lou wrote this because it's in her handwriting on the draft manuscript. I love manuscript. I always read the draft instead of the printed version. That's what archivists do. So at the end of this book on the Principles of Mining, there's sort of a poem to the mining profession saying mining engineers are different from people in other professions. As opposed to soldiers whose profession is destruction, engineers' profession is creation. And as opposed to lawyers whose career is based on quarrels, the engineer has to build something that everybody approves of and a bridge that will not fall down. So it's an incredible piece of kind of poetic writing, and it kind of shows her writing skills at its best. While she was working on the Principles of Mining for her husband, she initiated her masterpiece. So she was working simultaneously on Chinese history, history of Chinese mining, also on Egyptian mining, ancient Egypt, Principles of Mining in the 20th century. But what really caught her eye, I'm going to come back to this. What really caught her eye was a book that her mentor had called De Re Metallica, which is about metals, written by a guy named Agricola. It was published in 1556. And this is a major treatise on the history of mining. And it was a very influential book. Agricola was a brilliant scholar. He spent 25 years writing this, all the technology of mining and how it all works. And it was revealing professional secrets. So mining was a heavily secretive profession. The proprietary information was passed down from master to apprentice. And it wasn't something you were supposed to reveal to other people. But he did it. Agricola did it. He finished the book in 1550 and organized it so it would be published after his death. It was his letter to the future. And he had beautiful diagrams in it that kind of workers could follow to do the construction work. But the actual text is written in very, very high level Latin that only a small number of managers could figure out. And he invented lots of words. So nobody, since 1556, when the book was published, until 1912, nobody quite knew what Agricola was talking about. But Lou figured it out. Her Latin was fantastic, but more importantly, her German was extremely good. She took 2 years of German at Stanford. Her Latin she knew from high school. That was standard in high school. And she did hire a Latinist from the British Museum to do some fundamental translating, but the important part was to reverse engineer and figure out what Agricola was talking about. And so this book that she published with her husband's name as the main author, she translated the Latin. She not only translated it, but she decrypted it and decoded what the technology was. And this was a revelation because this was proprietary information that had been hidden for many, many years. People knew it was a great book, but they didn't quite know the extent. It had never been translated into English. And even the German translation wasn't very good. It didn't make sense. And she made sense out of the technology. Now, Herbert Hoover was also very interested in this. So I don't want to slight his part of it, but it was her idea. We know she started this in 1906 because in 1905, there was finally information about Agricola's life. And so she found that in the British Museum. She translated the book. She took information and from the ancient world and the modern world and figured out what was going on. And so we have on the left, the mine shafts from the ancient world. So this is from the 16th century. And then we have diagrams from Herbert Hoover's book of the mine shafts from the 20th century. And you can see she is using the concept that Agricola, this Latin, he was German, this German Latin writing scholar used these drawings, and she updated them for modern circumstances. And if you look down in here, there are little men in the mine shafts. She loved going into the mine, so you can understand she related, he did too. They both, Herbert Hoover and Lou, related to going down into the earth. It was kind of a metaphysical experience, kind of a mystical experience for both of them. Underground, you have these little men with funny hats and funny beards, and that's what they're holding, picks, the mining picks. And they're winches for bringing the baskets of ore up, and they're developing ore carts. And here's a guy pushing an ore cart. This is the origin, railroads come from this technology that was used in Germany in a place called Freiberg in the 1550s. And it was still being used in the 20th century. Oh. Here we have the 16th century version and the 20th century version, both books edited and published by Lou Henry Hoover. And the part that's kind of interesting on the 16th century version is it shows the devastation and deforestation caused by mining. It was something that people were very aware of in the ancient world. And Lou Henry Hoover was also aware of it. I mean, if you travel in the Sierras, you can see all the damage from the gold rush. Today, it's still visible. So this book was recognized as a masterpiece. And the Mining and Metallurgical Society in 1914 invented a gold medal, and they had to give it to both Hoovers. They knew she had done most of the work, but they gave it to both Hoovers. And you can see here, this was the first time they did the medal, to Herbert C. and Lou Henry Hoover, a gold medal, and they had a big fancy dinner. And because Lou was a woman, they had to allow men to bring their wives to the dinners. Normally it was a men's only event. And a few women actually, I saw a picture, a few women actually braved and showed up, but women were not allowed to join until Lou. She was the first member of this society. And there's something funny going on with this medal. If any of you know the significance of this semi-draped lady, please email me and let me know. But she
leave a message, please.
The goddess who is in the mountain. And ancient cultures visualize the goddess of the mountain as protecting the minerals, but being kind to some miners and being vicious to others. So I think this is the spirit of the mountain. But if you figure it out, let me know. Now, there hadn't been a good German translation. And so in 1912, Lou Henry Hoover castigates the Germans for not having come up with a proper translation of the Latin. And they were immediately going into World War I, which was devastating for Germany, but they had recovered enough in 1928 to do a proper German translation of Lou Henry Hoover's masterpiece. And they do credit her for her research. They said we only had to translate the Latin into the German. We knew what the technical processes were because Herbert Hoover and Lou Henry Hoover had figured it out for us. So they really acknowledged her work as well as his. Somebody else was reading De Re Metallica, And it was a man named Louis Mumford. And he figured out that these drawings, partly from all the annotations that Lou had written on modern technology and how it relates to ancient technology, he figured out that the mining technology used in 16th century Germany was what led to railroads, the paddle wheels and the windmills, led to steam engines. And so he wrote this incredible book that has really changed the way we look at the history of science, called Technics and Civilization. It's still considered a monument to the history of science today. And it was inspired by Lou Henry Hoover's research. And she never knew. The two of them, as far as I know, never actually talked to each other. They were on the Stanford campus at the same time for a symposium in 1941, but I don't believe they met. By then, her politics and his politics were too different. He was quite left-wing and she was loyal to her husband. And so I don't believe she ever realized how influential she was in our understanding of the history of technology. And she's remembered as a great first lady, but I want you to remember her as a great scientist who's made one really fantastic lasting contribution to the history of science. After she passed away, there was a publishing company named Dover that does reprints. And they asked Herbert Hoover's permission to reprint Lou Henry Hoover and Herbert Hoover's book, De Re Metallica. And Herbert Hoover, I read his letter. It said, yeah, if you want to reprint it, go ahead. But, you know, I don't think anyone's going to read it or buy it. But, you know, do what you want to do. And the book has been continuously in print since Dover redid it. So it's been actually in print since 1912. It's never gone out of print. It's been read by all kinds of important scientists who've incorporated it into their concept of the history of technology. And meanwhile, she had, after publishing it, she moved on to public service and the Girl Scouts, you know, trying to help women become, you know, young women become, you know, more self-sufficient and more athletic. So she went on to other things, but she was always a techie. And she loved her typewriter, she loved her car, she liked driving cross country, and she also loved cameras. And she took lots of pictures on her travels. And she also got a movie camera and took home movies of the White House. And frolicking in the White House with her puppies and her grandchildren. And let's see.
Elena, we're not getting the sound.
Ah, okay. Well, here you can see her using an advanced kind of color film. They didn't even know it was color because you have to put it through a special camera. And they only recently preserved the film. You can see the president of Stanford is a tall, skinny guy in the white shirt. That's Ray Lyman Wilbur. He was a classmate of Bert and Lou's and was president of Stanford while Bert made him Secretary of the Interior and put him in charge of building Hoover Dam. So he built Hoover Dam with Secretary of the Interior, president of Stanford, and Herbert Hoover and Lou Henry Hoover's best friend. So I hope you come away and remember two things. Lou Henry Hoover was more than First Lady. She was a scientist. And Her masterpiece is still important over 100 years later, and it's De Re Metallica. Thank you very much.
Oh, great job. Great job. Everybody's muted, Elena, so you can't hear the cacophony.
Oh, okay.
Oh, that's wonderful. I guess I can't. Suzanne.
Okay, yes, so I'm going to ask you some questions. First of all, will you tell us what you did as an archivist?
Oh, okay.
I mean, you pick up a sheet of paper and Sally says you save everything.
Okay, I had every single possible job in the archives. I started as a cataloger, so I'd get this mountain of papers like you can see behind Sally Herrick, behind my desk, and then I would have to organize it so people could use it and create an index. That I thought was heaps of fun because I got to read other people's mail. So that's really what an archivist does. You read somebody else's mail and it's something they didn't intend you to see. And so it's much more honest than what people publish. So when something is published, I lose interest. But before it's published, that's when you get the real truth. And then I had a wonderful job that I loved in the reading room, helping scholars find the documents for their books. And that I met some really incredible scholars that way. It was really fun. Pulitzer Prize winners and Nobel Prize winners. It was fabulous. And my next job was collection development. And so I would work with donors to get their papers. So, ambassadors and, I was in heaven. And I worked in the archives 27 years and I didn't get bored once, not one day, not one day. There were ups and downs, but never, ever was I bored. So I did a little of everything, Suzanne.
So another question is, are there any biographies of Lou Henry Hoover?
Okay, now. I'm glad you asked. There are a couple. There's one here by Ann Beiser Allen, an independent woman. There's one that was published in the year 2000. There's one, Lou Henry Hoover, Nancy Beck Young. So those are good, they're good biographies, but each of them devotes one page to De Re Metallica, which is her masterpiece. And the books don't give her credit for her work as a professional geologist and a scientist. So I think there's room for another biography.
So
Are you going to write it?
I don't think I'm the right person. I like to collect papers and I like
her name. What about Lou's name? Lou Henry.
Okay, so most people think she's a man when they first hear the name. I did. I thought, oh, that must be Herbert Hoover's brother or something, but no. And her name is deliberately androgynous. Her parents kind of raised her in kind of a macho way. She was always going horseback riding and fishing and hunting and all that. So the androgynous name was something she was very happy with. And I noticed on one of her school notebooks, actually it was a Stanford notebook, she put her name on the notebook as Lou, L-E-W, Hank, H-A-N-K. And when she submitted her article on the Empress of China, she gave the author as Henry Hoover. So she kind of played with the androgyny a little bit, yeah. She was ahead of her time in many, many ways.
So another question, of course, we always have a cocktail with each of our programs. And in honor of Prohibition, we have a bathtub gin. Would she have joined us with the bathtub gin?
Did she have a brother? Oh, I'm sorry.
So Lou Henry Hoover was a teetotaler, and so I'm drinking tea in honor of Lou, but you drink the bathtub gin because Herbert Hoover was known to have a sip now and then. As president, he felt obligated to enforce the law of the land. but she was opposed to alcohol because she was such a fitness freak. But Herbert Hoover, there's a story that I don't know if it's true. There are lots of apocryphal stories, but sometimes there's a grain of truth in them. And the story is when Herbert Hoover was president, when he wanted a drink, since it was against the law because of prohibition, he would go to the Belgian embassy because that was sort of international territory. And so it would be legal to drink with the Belgians, yeah. So, yeah, and she did not have a brother or anything, but yeah, so she did serve wine. There are reports she did serve wine with dinner when they lived in London because that was the custom in London. But she herself was not a drinker. He, however, was known to indulge.
So he would join us. Tell us about your teacup.
Oh, so I've always collected Royal Copenhagen china, which is blue and white, and it's real porcelain with the real formula that was rediscovered in the 18th century. My mother collects it, my grandmother collected it. And I was so surprised. I was serving tea to Herbert Hoover III and his wife Meredith in my office when I was director. And I was serving them tea in my teacups. And Mrs. Hoover, this is Mrs. Hoover III, said, "Oh, Lou Henry Hoover had the same teacups." And it turned, this is totally coincidental, you know. But from then on, I knew she was a woman of great taste, you know, no question.
Of course she was. One more question. Tell us, we know that she influenced her husband a lot. Can you tell us some the reading other people's mail, or can you tell us something that we would not know?
So she was a very enigmatic person. So her two biographers that I mentioned, Allen and Young, they claim they have no idea what her personal thoughts were. I don't think anyone actually did. Her parents didn't even know she was getting married till a week ahead of time. So she was very friendly and outgoing, but she never tipped her hand. And it was just part of her personality. So I don't see her ever trying to persuade her husband directly. I think she always did it indirectly. And I think she had a great influence on him, but I think she did it by example. You saw Herbert Hoover playing a form of volleyball on the White House grounds, and he wasn't very good at it. She was a fitness freak. She believed in exercise, and I'm sure she encouraged Ray Lyman Wilbur, the Secretary of Interior, who was a medical doctor, to persuade Herbert Hoover to exercise. She would never have done it directly. And then she had some opinions about exercise for women. And so she got involved with women's organizations, the Women's Athletic Association. She was one of the first to promote women's athletics. And then she encouraged her husband to promote various philanthropies. And so he was also inclined to be philanthropic. That was kind of part of his Quaker background. And so she kind of worked with her philanthropies and then kind of encouraged him to work with his. So she influenced him. She was a heavy influence on him, but I think it was indirect. He knew she was incredibly smart. He knew she was very popular. When he proposed, he was afraid he was going to lose her because there were other suitors. She had other options. And so she did influence him. He really admired her. And she was a proponent of women's rights and the right to vote. And he also was a supporter of women's right to vote. And I think she indirectly, just by her example, influenced him to believe that women voting would improve society. So she made many statements to that effect, and he picked up her attitudes. So I don't think she influenced him by telling him stuff. I think she influenced him indirectly. But that was the way she worked. And I think for her, it was a good strategy, but then she never got credit for all of her. Yeah. Okay, are those the questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Francie.
Deborah, oh, one more question.
This is way before. I entered a few minutes late, and I was just wondering if anybody told you, Elena and Sally, that Charlotte Schultz is a member of ARCS.
Yes, yes. No.
Oh, okay.
Actually, Nancy told us, and
No, do you
but I
know
got to,
Sally is a relative of Charlotte's
well, but it's by marriage and
by
it's
marriage,
remote,
but nevertheless,
but I'm not surprised, Cheryl, and I hope she's been active. Has she? Because she's very much of a doer, but not recently, I'm sure.
of various times.
Yeah, good. Well,
Yeah, she was a big doer originally, but
Mm.
she's been married to George. And she was, you know, the protocol, what is it? The lady of
Hoover protocol.
yeah,
City Hall. So she's been very busy.
yeah.
So thank you. And
I
Deborah,
was going to say one thing. Somebody brought it up earlier, and I can't remember the exact title, but today is National Women's Science Whatever Day. What is it? Can you help that with
So
that?
February 11th was declared by the United Nations to be International Day of Women and Girls in Science. So it was highly appropriate that we had this subject, although I think it was just coincidental.
oh no,
Serendipity.
never planned it that way.
We surely did plan it that way. Come on. I think that's I think the teacup and the challenge to women are just fabulous.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. Elena, I was going to say you're like an encyclopedia, but you can't say that anymore. Nobody says that.
No, it hasn't.
You're just absolutely overwhelming. And you've brought Lou Henry Hoover, you've made her alive now.
Yeah.
So
I'm
I
glad.
have
I'm glad.
dinner with her. I'm sure everybody feels the same way.
Absolutely, yes.
So
Thank you.
much. And Sally, I know everybody here is hoping that you will introduce them going forward. because
Oh, well,
fantastic.
let me tell you, it's a delight to introduce Elena because, and the problem is that you get carried away telling stories because she's just endless information and it's always upbeat and wonderful and makes it so accessible for everyone. She's just unique. So,
Well, this friendship and this co-admiration society is just palpable. And so I haven't known either one of you for very long, but what a pleasure this has been. Nancy?
I will send the email out with the link to that old Lou Henry Hoover video
good.
in
Oh,
code
good.
fantastic.
because
Fantastic.
it has the 20s music with it. And
Yeah.
that, we got it the other day, but today we couldn't. So I think it would be fun for you. So I have a list of participants and I will send it to all of you. If I don't have your email,
Fantastic.
then I'll find.
I also, Suzanne Roth, one of our sister ARCs, our ARC sisters, whose mind does not stop and has the most exciting friends. This was wonderful. And thanks for making this possible. And then there's Nancy on the drums. I mean, in the it was just absolutely fantastic. Thank you all for coming. I want to just put a plug in as we continue. Judy and I, Judy Webster, where are you, there you are.
Yes.
So next month we continue with our, I thought we should rename this the Genius Bar, but it's been done. So our science activities, March 11th, it's the future of science and how it will be funded. Dr. Robert Kirshner, he taught for 35 years at Harvard. He is an astronomer and he is the, what is his title? Chief Program Officer for Science for the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation.
Oh,
I mean, it's going to be exciting, and you will be excited to know that Linda Millard, one of our very own, is going to do the introduction and hopefully moderate the evening. And then a special treat, we have an optional dinner with McCall's that will be delivered to your door if you're so inclined. so you can eat while you're learning. Anyway, thank you all so much for coming. This is a very exciting series for us, making the best of being home. So have a great rest of the evening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye
Thank
now.
you.
Elena.
And thank you, Elena.
Oh,
Thank you,
thanks
thank
for
you,
joining
thank
us,
you.
Franz.
Fabulous.
Thank you, Sally.
Thank you.
See you later.
Thank you, Sally.
Fabulous evening. Thank you so
Everybody.
much.
The sisterhood is alive.
It is.
I wish I knew Lou.
Fabulous, fabulous.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Oh, giant city, yeah. Oh, goodness. Linda Williams. Okay, I'll close it out.